So we're going to go ahead and talk about the required cases for our AP exam for the College Board for our midterm. First case is McCulloch versus Maryland. We talked about the McCulloch versus Maryland case in our unit on federalism, and it really establishes important concepts when it comes to the relationship between the state and federal governments. For all of these cases, you should understand the basic facts. What is this case about? It's imperative you know what the constitutional clauses at issue in the case are that the Supreme Court is using to make their rulings. And then what are the key precedents, the long-term impacts of the case, and how do they, maybe potentially impact other future cases? In McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819, the state of Maryland tried to impose a tax on the National Bank of the United States. The United States, the National Bank, didn't believe that they could be taxed, that they didn't believe the states had the power to tax. And so this is a dispute that the Supreme Court took up and issued a ruling on. Now, their ruling was based on the Commerce Clause, the Necessary Proper Clause, and the Supremacy Clause. Basically, what the Supreme Court said was, first of all, if Maryland is going to argue that the United States doesn't have the authority to create a national bank, then their argument is invalid, because that authority, even though it doesn't explicitly list in the Constitution that the Congress has the authority to create a national bank, it is an implied power according to the Supreme Court under the Necessary and Proper Clause. If Congress has the power to regulate commerce, which they do under Article 1, then one can imply that it is also necessary and proper, using the Necessary and Proper Clause, for them to create a national bank in order to help them do that. The Necessary and Proper Clause is the last part of Article 1, Section 8, which says that Congress can pass any law that it deems necessary and proper to carry out its foregoing powers. There's also the use of the Supremacy Clause. If Maryland is able to tax a national bank, then this would effectively, according to John Marshall in his opinion, this would effectively give them the power to destroy the national bank. And the argument that the Supreme Court made was that the national government is supreme to the states. The Supremacy Clause of the Constitution in Article 6 clearly says that the supreme law of the land is the Constitution. And so Maryland's argument that they should be able to tax a national bank is also invalid. So this dramatically, as its precedent, it dramatically establishes the supremacy of the national government and expands the scope and power of the Necessary and Proper Clause and the Commerce Clause, which will be used over and over again in the nation's history to expand the power of the federal government and justify federal action. So McCulloch versus Maryland is really a landmark case for those reasons. Also in our unit on federalism is the case U.S. versus Lopez. And this is kind of a counterbalance to the McCulloch versus Maryland case, if you're going to understand that there are cases out there that expand the power of the federal government as it relates to the states. There are also cases out there that restrict federal power and federal authority, and U.S. versus Lopez is one of those. So this is a federalism case, and basically the question was, can the Commerce Clause be used to justify a federal law that bans the possession of guns in school zones? So this is something Congress tried to do, is pass the Gun-Free School Zones Act in the 1990s, saying that you can't possess, it's a violation of federal law to knowingly possess a gun in a school zone. This was argued as unconstitutional because this is not a enumerated power in the Constitution, and it's not connected to enumerated power in the Constitution. Now, the federal government's going to make the argument, and this is the clause involved, that it is related to interstate commerce. They're going to make a kind of tangential, loosely connected argument saying that gun violence can reduce property values, it can impact trade in other ways, and therefore by trying to regulate guns in this fashion, they're really regulating commerce, and it falls under the Commerce Clause. In this case, the Supreme Court does not agree with this. They basically take the stance that regulating guns is not related to commerce, it's not related to a enumerated power in the Constitution, or at least regulating guns in this particular fashion. The Commerce Clause argument does not hold water. And so they strike down the law. And what's the big outcome here is that the Commerce Clause has its limits. Power is returned to the states in this regard, and it's taken away from the federal government. The Commerce Clause is not an unlimited clause. Now, we've looked at a number of Commerce Clause cases. I've talked about it in other videos, and we talked about it in class. So it's certainly worth going back and looking at our Commerce Clause lesson, because the Commerce Clause is a clause that's used to expand federal power dramatically over the years, but they do kind of run into some limitations here, in this case, U.S. versus Lopez. So we'll stop here, and these two cases are a good place to pause, and we'll move on to the next cases in future videos.